Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon to the monolinguals, to the bilinguals, to multilinguals, and to friends, of course, of bilinguals and multilinguals. My name is Wanga Kambusha, and I am welcoming all of you on behalf of my other conveners, Karel and Gweri. And I'm, of course, here to introduce our speaker for the evening. And we are very happy to have George Hall here, who will be giving a presentation tonight. So let me say a few words about George. George is a senior lecturer in philosophy, in the philosophy department. His research interests are on social and political philosophy. He is co-author of Business Ethics and Other Paradoxes. He's editor of The Equal Society and editor of Debating African Philosophy. He has published articles in several international and philosophy journals and gave testimony to the Hehe Commission of Inquiry into Higher Education. Can you please welcome George?
Thank you very much, Wanga. I don't know whether this microphone, yeah, it seems to be working. That's fine. Well, first of all, it's a great honor, of course, to give a talk in the series. So thank you for inviting me. And particularly in this case where it's not a talk particularly on language or literature, but it is a talk on theory, which at least purports to apply to the study of language and literature as much as it does to other disciplines and to anything else. So my topic is epistemic ethnonationalism. And look, I'm aware how irritating it is when academics take a perfectly good concept, they stick the word epistemic in front of it, and then they go around acting like they've made a new discovery. But I'm going to try to persuade you over the course of the next 40 minutes that this concept, epistemic ethnonationalism, even if it's not a new discovery, it does help us to zero in on what is, I think, perhaps unexpected, and as I will also argue, troubling common ground between a number of contemporary new directions in theory from various different parts of the world, some seeming to be on the left, and others seeming to be on the right. Indeed, some seeming to be on the far left and some seeming to be on the far right. So perhaps this is a case of the extremes touching. Today I'm going to focus on two of those, not because I think that they're the only two cases, but I'm going to limit it to decoloniality theory and neo-traditionalism. So let me first introduce those two theories and say a little bit about the avenues in which they exercise their influence. I'm not exaggerating, I'm not claiming that they control the world or that they exercise a huge amount of influence, but they do exercise some influence, and that's why it's important what they say. All right, so the most influential contemporary form of neo-traditionalism, I'll come on to what that means, is what is called Eurasianism. In fact, it's sometimes called neo-Eurasianism, but I don't want too many neos in the talk, so it's just Eurasianism for today. Eurasianism holds that the world divides into 4 or 5 ethnocultural spheres, or great spaces, each of which ought to be run according to its own values or according to its own particular and incommensurable horizon of being. So it's a theory which combines the geopolitical and the philosophical, and that's quite characteristic of its architect and energetic promoter who we just saw in the clip, Aleksandr Dugin. So Aleksandr Dugin, Eurasianism's inventor, is said never to have directly advised the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Yet his ideas have undoubtedly achieved uptake in government circles. His textbook was for a while prescribed reading at the General Staff Academy, and his doctrine of Eurasianism was one of the factors which seems to have shaped the justification Putin offered for the invasion of Ukraine ongoing. Now, Dugin was influenced by the founder of traditionalism, René Guénon, and Julius Evola, when he was in Moscow in the esotericist Yuzhinsky circle as a young man. That was a dissident circle. It sought to combat the Soviet regime, but to do so metaphysically, by attaining to a different level of reality. As a rule, the theorists of integral traditionalism, of which Guénon is the founder, they acquired their intellectual training and propagated their ideas initially in occultist circles like that, circles which tried to practice magic, or else in perhaps similar Sufi tariqas. Dugin, quite unusually for a traditionalist, did have a brief spell at a university, but his time teaching international relations at Moscow State University came to an end when he was filmed exhorting his compatriots to kill, kill, kill Ukrainian nationalists. René Guénon embraced Sufi Islam early in the 20th century, as did more recently the Brazilian Olavo de Carvalho, who died this year, and who was a close advisor of the current president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro. He also used to give YouTube philosophy lectures, which you may have seen. The Italian traditionalist Julius Evola, there at the top, wrote on magic, of course, and probably participated in rites to try to restore the Roman Empire. The superstitious Prime Minister of Italy, Benito Mussolini, was very frightened of Evola's magical powers, or what he thought were magical powers, but he also commissioned Evola to create a fascist, as opposed to a National Socialist, doctrine of race. So he was also quite influential at the time. In the past few years, traditionalist ideas even gained a foothold in Washington because Steve Bannon, who's been in the news recently, is a follower of Evola and Guénon, at least to some extent. I don't want to exaggerate how much influence that held on American policy. But he did have face-to-face interactions with Dugin and also with Olavo de Carvalho. And so that's an interesting connection between traditionalism and also American politics. Okay, so and traditionalist ideas did to some extent shape the version of populist nationalism which Bannon was promoting as chairman of Breitbart and perhaps in his official role for the president. Okay, so that's traditionalism, and let me say more about how neo-traditionalism differs from the first generation in a moment. But first, let's go on to decoloniality theory. By decoloniality theory, I don't mean efforts to decolonize the curriculum. I don't mean general approaches to addressing bias due to colonialism in, areas of study or the way that we teach. Decoloniality theory is a body of theory. It's an anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-colonial body of academic writing that has grown up and come to prominence at least since the 1990s. It has roots in Marxism, and it's generally thought to be of the progressive left. So the most recognizable thesis of decoloniality theorists, I'm talking about Quijano, Mignolo, Maldonado-Torres, and Ndlovu-Gatsheni, is that there is a colonial matrix of power which has existed for the last half millennium and is constituted by hierarchical planet-wide forms of discrimination, domination, and exclusion. Economic exploitation, race, sex, sexual orientation, discrimination, which constitute the coloniality of power, but also the repression or undermining of bodies of knowledge, the coloniality of knowledge, and even a metaphysical hierarchy within being itself. That's the coloniality of being, which we'll come back to. If societies of the global south are to progress from just decolonization to decoloniality, dismantling the colonial matrix of power, this will occur primarily through critical reactivation of subaltern knowledges. As Ndlovu-Gatsheni has written, only an epistemological rebellion can overcome epistemological dependency. That already indicates the way that decoloniality theorists have moved some distance from the dependency theory in which they have their origins. And that's figures like Prebisch, Gunder Frank, Immanuel Wallerstein, and Walter Rodney, who exercised a great influence on them. Decoloniality theorists have argued there can be no true economic delinking, which is what dependency theory advocates, of peripheral countries from the core of the world economy, without a prior and more fundamental epistemic delinking from the thought patterns of Western modernity. And I should mention Quijano co-authored with Wallerstein, so that's a particular thread of influence. So if neo-traditionalism's sphere of influence is an unlikely duo, fringe spiritualist circles and the highest levels of power in at least 3 powerful countries. Decoloniality theory's avenues of influence are more humdrum. It's sociology and cultural studies journals, networks of academics, university campuses in the Americas, in Europe, in Southern Africa. The leading formulators of decoloniality theory there at the bottom, they've occupied prestigious professorships. For example, Ndlovu-Gatsheni, he was at UNISA. He's now moved on to Bayreuth. So basically, this is senior common room, high table stuff, which we have from the decoloniality theorists. To the extent that decoloniality theory has impacted politics, it has so far been of the low stakes campus variety. To some extent here in South Africa, Rhodes Must Fall, and perhaps not so big in the general scheme of things, but certainly here at UCT, our curriculum change framework, it draws somewhat dogmatically on the Latin American perspective on coloniality. And when you have a faculty curriculum review, this is the first point of reference you're asked to look at. Okay, so I should also mention that it is beginning, this language, to come into politics. One interesting place where that's happened is in India, where Sai Deepak, who's associated with the Hindu right, wrote a book just a couple of years ago called India That Is Bharat, which directly draws on Mignolo's decoloniality theory. Okay, I'm going to mention another example of how decoloniality theory has entered politics in a moment, or at the end. So my purpose here is to outline how, despite their very different intellectual starting points, and the fact that one is associated with the far left, the other with the far right, both neo-traditionalism and decoloniality theory have converged on a doctrine with troubling practical consequences, which I call epistemic ethnonationalism. Now, epistemic ethnonationalism, this denies that there are universal epistemic standards by which the truth, coherence, or well-foundedness of beliefs can be assessed. So in postmodernist style, it dismisses the declared aspiration to universal validity of argument or belief as nothing but a power play, as a move in a political game. However, it doesn't follow postmodernism in assigning beliefs, theories, and methods to free-floating discourses in which we believers and we asserters are just the unwitting pawns. Rather, epistemic ethnonationalism associates with each ethnos or ethne a set of beliefs, concepts, or theoretical frames which are proper to it, such that a member of ethnos E1 who embraces concepts or theories or methods proper to ethnos E2 is doing something wrong. They're confused, or they're brainwashed, or they're engaged in some form of collaboration. So I'm going to highlight these striking similarities in theory design, which you can find in decoloniality theory and neo-traditionalism. As I go along, I'm going to highlight a few ways in which we should go about justifying the cogency or the justifiability of this doctrine. For this kind of analysis, I think the left-right spectrum in politics has limited use. I won't draw on it very much. But I do think that if neo-traditionalism, like Dugin's Eurasianism, is to be counted as a doctrine of the right, it's very hard to avoid doing the same with the decoloniality theorists. All right, now let's roll back a bit to traditionalism, the first generation of traditionalists. It was Evola, Julius Evola, who brought Guénon's perennialist traditionalism into politics. Guénon was a perennialist in the sense that he thought that there was one tradition which stands at the origin of all of the world's major religions, and the idea was to decode that. Evola wrote in the 1950s the books at the bottom of the screen, and his politics was against liberalism, or the subversion introduced to Europe by the revolutions. Evola believed that what was needed was a true political class who could govern, in Europe at least, according to what he called the tradition. He compared it to a knightly order, which should not revive previous social forms, because he thought that actually the tradition with a capital T hadn't ever been instantiated fully, but it should be, this should be achieved, government should be according to the great European political tradition. Evola, he's clear that this is a hierarchical society. To some extent, he leaves it a little bit vague what this mode of government would look like. What he also leaves vague is whether societies elsewhere in the world, for example, in Asia, in Africa, in the Americas, should also be governed according to the European political tradition. At one stage, he deplores the fact that a series of non-European peoples are renouncing their traditions and have westernized, adopting the culture, ideologies, political forms, and lifestyles of white peoples. Now, the notion that there exists a multiplicity of different but equally valid traditions, which is at most hinted at or entertained by the first generation of traditionalists, has become the centerpiece of contemporary neo-traditionalism. By the beginning of the 21st century, Aleksandr Dugin, who was a dissident during Soviet times, had concluded that for Russia, liberalism does not fit. But he also thought communism and fascism were unacceptable, so he set himself the task of inventing a fourth political theory, and he wrote a book with that name. Dugin remained a traditionalist, and his fourth political theory was to be on the side of tradition, yet he was also drawn to the Eurasian current of thought, going back to interwar thinkers, and even back to the 19th century, people like Konstantin Leontiev and Nikolai Danilevsky, who emphasized Russia's unique civilization and claimed for it a special cultural and political leadership role in Eurasia, that landmass encompassing Europe and Asia. Dugin came to regard the US-backed economic reforms of the Yeltsin era, also democracy, the markets, individualism, human rights, as actually local and historically specific values, specific to the West. Viewed in this light, Aleksandr Dugin saw that there was potential for a critique of the post-Cold War order, which invoked liberal egalitarianism's own commitment to non-discrimination. Globalization, he alleged, is nothing more than a globally deployed model of Western European, or rather Anglo-Saxon, ethnocentrism, which is the purest manifestation of racist ideology. Dugin's Eurasianism is thus, in the first place, a program for government of the Eurasian great space, centered on Moscow, according to its own distinctive body of tradition, not that of outsiders. In the second place, though, neo-traditionalism in the hands of Dugin is something a little bit more ambitious. And let me illustrate that by showing the difference between it and Evola's classical traditionalism. First of all, he's a little bit more ambivalent towards liberalism than Evola is. Liberalism is not condemned outright. It's a cultural system that has a right to exist. It is the cultural system of the Anglo-Saxon ethnos, but it can only exist alongside other cultural systems. Unlike Evola, Dugin explicitly affirms a plurality of traditions, and he says that every ethnos has its own tradition. Dugin proposes that we accept the ethnos as the historical subjects, and that we view the ethnos in the plural without trying to establish any kind of hierarchy among them. So while there might rightfully be hierarchy within civilizations, there's no common or universal measure by which you could judge different ethnic groups. So he's against hierarchy between ethnoses. So the general view of Eurasianism applies to the whole world and applies to the idea of values and belief systems in general, is the following. Eurasianism in itself is gnoseological plurality. It rejects a unitary episteme. It opposes that with the multiplicity of epistemes. The Eurasianist episteme for Russian civilization, the Chinese for the Chinese, the Islamic for Islam, the Indian for the Indian. So gnoseological plurality, what does that mean in practice? Well, it means that if you were to say to Dugin about one of his more outlandish claims, well, surely you can't believe that. All the evidence suggests that that's not true. Dugin is going to reply to you.
So we have our special Russian truth that you need to accept as something that maybe is not your truth, even if it's not true. But
the special Russian truth. And every ethnos has its own special truth, according to this view. All right, now when Dugin attributes specific ideas and values to ethnos 1, others to ethnos 2, and so on, the attribution is not tautological, by which I mean that it is not in Dugin's eyes by accepting or espousing a specific set of ideas or values that one comes to be of a particular ethnos. one doesn't sort people into ethnoses by checking what concepts or values they operate with. Otherwise, it could not have happened that, as Dugin recounts, Russian and consequently Eurasian reformers of the 1980s and 90s espoused liberal democratic policy, which he describes as the structure and logic of the West. Nor could so many Georgians, Georgia in Eurasia, have embraced Atlanticist values, as he describes them, and their government have sought a partnership with the United States and NATO, despite Georgia being Eurasian. So Dugin doesn't ascribe ethnos membership to people based on what they overtly say or the values which guide their behavior, but rather based on what he calls their deep identity, an organic, existential, basic identity that lies below what he calls diffused identity or the collectivity in its actual state. So just because somebody has E2 type values, concepts, and beliefs, that doesn't necessarily mean they're a member of ethnos E2. If at the level of deep identity, Dugin's going to sort them into ethnos E1, then they're doing something wrong. They ought to have E1 type values, concepts, and beliefs, but they don't. That's the way this theory works. Right, let's move on to decoloniality theory. In decoloniality theory as well, over the past few decades, there has been a transition from a universalism to relativism. Quijano introduced the concept coloniality or coloniality of power to refer to, first of all, the widespread belief in races and racial differences between human beings, and secondly, the existence of a global hierarchical division of labor based on those purported differences. He thought that coloniality of power, in that sense, outlasted colonialism and explains why industrial wage labor was for so long concentrated in Europe and North America, because to different race groups was generally assigned different forms of work. The modern world system of the core and the underdeveloped periphery, he's moving a little bit away from the economism or economic determinism of classic dependency theory, is constituted for Quijano, a Peruvian theorist, by an economic structure and a racialized social order which are mutually reinforcing. So you can't give a purely economic description of the modern world system. Now, the second generation of decoloniality theorists has gone further, affirming the explanatory primacy of ideas and beliefs, or the epistemic domain. The second generation of decoloniality theorists says that the modern world system and the global order are epistemic creations. So that's moving all the way away from the economic determinism. That's Ndlovu-Gatsheni. The second generation of decoloniality theorists has also generalized Quijano's conclusion about racial concepts and their role in coloniality in an unexpected way. And this can be seen in Walter Mignolo's latest tome on the politics of decolonial investigations. So he writes, race and gender are two concepts of Western modernity that make us believe they represent something that exists. Behind race, there is an implied logic of classification, and likewise behind gender. So that's exactly what Quijano would also say. But look at what he says next. The classifications shape and guide our perception of society. However, decolonial gnoseological, heard that word before, gnoseological assumptions say that names and classifications do not refer to what there is, but frame what we perceive. So rather than holding, like Quijano, simply that races and genders, at least as commonsensically conceived of, do not exist, Mignolo adopts the far more radical position that concepts and categories across the board are incapable of pointing us to actual commonalities and differences in the world. Quijano's, the first generation, objection to belief in races had been empirical. He agreed with mainstream biology that races don't exist. Mignolo's objection, by contrast, is metaphysical. He denies the capacity of concepts as such, and therefore the beliefs in which they figure, to refer to reality. And this is one instance of a general tendency in contemporary decoloniality theory, which I describe as hyper-philosophism. The first generation, still close to dependency theory and world systems analysis, criticized not only racist doctrines, but also orthodox doctrines of political economy for being in the first place false, and in the second place likely, when pervasively believed, to advance the economic interests of the core of the world system. Decoloniality theory's second generation, from the same evidential basis, has drawn the drastically undermotivated metaphysical conclusion that beliefs are not the kind of thing which can ever be outright true or false. All right, well, having relieved itself of the necessity of checking theories for factual correctness, how does contemporary decoloniality theory evaluate statements at all? This is where the coloniality of knowledge comes in. Just like the coloniality of power sorts people into a hierarchy which needs to be overcome so that we get to an egalitarian state, so, according to contemporary decoloniality theorists, there is a coloniality of knowledge, or what they also sometimes call knowledges, where different knowledges or different systems of knowledge or different epistemes have been ranked hierarchically, and that ranking also needs to be overcome so that we get an egalitarianism of knowledge. So that's Ramon Grosfoguel deploring the fact that European or Euro-American colonial expansion and domination was able to construct a hierarchy of superior and inferior knowledge. Ndlovu-Gatsheni saying the goal, decolonially speaking, is to put all onto epistemic traditions in a non-dominant and equal position, and that puts flesh on the bones of Mignolo's programmatic statement that decoloniality theory is not about adding to knowledge, but rather articulating a new politics of knowledge. Okay, now decoloniality theorists don't advocate for what one might call a straight discourse egalitarianism, the view that every theoretical body of knowledge that there is should be equally influential, equally taught, equally broadcast. Rather, just as in Dugin's Eurasianism, knowledges or worldviews, they come with flags attached to them, as it were. They're not to be detached from their geographical qualifiers. So we hear about the Spaniards imposing their concept of time, which differs from Andean time in what is now Peru and Bolivia. The imposition of Western epistemology, which marginalized African modes of knowing, American ideas which need to be combated with a new African episteme in Africa. Decoloniality theory's discourse egalitarianism looks to these geographical qualifiers on discourses, African, American, European, Euro-American, not only to determine which discourses should now be in egalitarian relations to each other, but where or among whom each discourse ought to exercise its influence. Decoloniality theorists, they deplore the universalizing of Western particularism. Since, in Mignolo's words, there is no one way or truth without parenthesis of what constitutes valid knowledge, what needs to be done is that decoloniality theory should dispel the myth of universality, and overstepping thinkers should be put back in their proper localism. So, for example, the Kantian legacy should be reduced to its proper localism. Note that the objection is not that Kant's theories are incorrect, or that they're in part incorrect and one needs to discard the false bits. Rather, it's that they need to be reduced to their proper localism, put back where they belong. The striking transformation which decoloniality theory has undergone in the past 3 or 4 decades since it was part of dependency theory can be illustrated in the figure of the comprador. In classic dependency, the comprador bourgeoisie plays the role of an indispensable intermediary for global capitalism. A small entrepreneurial class in a country of the economic periphery, the comprador bourgeoisie makes a tidy profit facilitating the export of raw materials and the import of manufactured goods, and also pressures its government to keep up what is ultimately a detrimental practice for the country's economy. Quijano initially added to this picture the thesis that reasons of economic self-interest weren't enough to motivate the comprador behavior, and what was also present, at least among the comprador bourgeoisie in Latin America, was racial solidarity with the European core. Contemporary decoloniality theory, though it does not regularly employ the term comprador, has a clear place, and a very different place, for the comprador bourgeoisie. This is not somebody who's primarily doing business or motivated by money, but rather it is a conduit for knowledge from the core, the West, Europe or America, into the periphery. The success, writes Ndlovu-Gatsheni, of colonialism and coloniality in the domain of knowledge is always dependent on winning some of the colonized people to its side. The epistemic comprador are those members of a global South society who, in Ndlovu-Gatsheni's words, though socially located on the oppressed side of the colonial difference, think and speak epistemically like those in the dominant position, such as, Ndlovu-Gatsheni again, the African elites who displayed problematic colonial consciousness. Mignolo likes to describe these figures as natives who are not locals, non-Westerners who have been taught to despise their narratives and accept the true one, which is the Western local narrative, which he describes as the narrative valid for Westerners. So they are, for instance, citizens of African countries who think within the Western episteme as opposed to the African episteme. Now, just like classic dependency theory, the contemporary decoloniality theorists blame the comprador class for consigning its society to economic backwardness, dependency, and underdevelopment. But contemporary decoloniality theory's ethne-based relativism provides it with a prior, more immediate reason to condemn the epistemic comprador. Here are thinkers and reasoners whose curiosity has led them to stray beyond a proper localism, to go beyond the pale, seeking enlightenment in ideas outside the episteme proper to their own ethne. And here is, let me just show you, Quijano unfortunately came round to this way of thinking as an old man. He said, "Nothing is less rational finally than the pretension that the specific cosmic vision of a particular ethne should be taken as universal rationality, even if such an ethne is called Western Europe. This is to pretend or to seek to impose a provincialism as universalism." I think there are problems with the translation there. All right, so where have we got to? Decoloniality theory and neo-traditionalism, from their very different starting points, have converged on a type of relativism at which the ethnos or ethne which one belongs to is central. This position can appear benign insofar as it prescribes acknowledgement, respect, and toleration of different cultures. But, as I've been emphasizing, for the individual persons who are assigned to an ethnos or an ethne, independent of what their beliefs and convictions may be, it prescribes conformity to the values and belief systems which they're told are proper to their ethnos or ethne. Okay, now, whether or not you agree with these theories, it's interesting to put yourself into the seat of the theorist and see that they're faced with a problem, which is that they owe the reader an account of the bearer of culture, the ethnos or ethne, which would explain why a specific cultural content, a specific episteme or values or beliefs are intrinsically proper or suited to such a bearer. Now, other theorists have called on the biological concepts of race and things like that to play that role, but that's not going to be any good because it's biologically discredited. So what the decoloniality theorists, what Dugin, what all epistemic ethnonationalists are looking for is a bearer of culture which, first of all, stays constant across changes in belief, so that you can say, hang on a minute, you're from ethnos 1, stop having those beliefs which are proper to ethnos 2. Secondly, it needs to support normative judgments about what we should be believing based on our ethnos. And thirdly, it needs to avoid being grounded in some kind of discredited concept such as race. So one option, of course, would be to stipulate that an ethnos or an ethne simply is a culture, or simply is those people who have a culture. The problem with that is then you don't have enough separation between ethnos and the contingent beliefs and values which somebody happens to hold. Okay, interestingly, both theoretical currents have here made a turn to metaphysics. And this turn to metaphysics is most straightforward in the case of Dugin's neo-traditionalism. Dugin doesn't ground our ethnos membership or what an ethnos is and what ethnos we belong to in anything physical, anything ethnic in the sense of racial about us. Rather, he grounds this in something metaphysical. Ethnicities, he says, are the subjects of history, and each possesses its own Dasein. All right, well, Dasein, that, of course, that's German for being there or existing, and that is a technical term in Heidegger. The philosopher Heidegger proposed this advance on the primarily cognitive subjects of conscious experience, which previous phenomenologists, like his teacher Husserl, had taken as the basis for their theoretical work. If Dasein is a subject, it is a subject not of detached states like perception or belief, but of that word lived experience, Erlebnis, which Dilthey made into a technical term back in the mid-19th century. Dasein's characteristic structure is care. It has a practical structure in which cognitive attitudes like perception and belief are only very secondary varieties. Dasein is always already practically involved in the world. It exhibits what is called being in the world, or in der Welt sein. And the contents of these projects and commitments will vary, partly depending on the contingent circumstances into which Dasein is thrown. But Heidegger, and that was in the 1920s, thought that certain fundamental structures or substructures of Dasein and in der Welt sein underlie and can be shown to be conditions on the possibility of the contingent variations in Dasein's worldly engagement. He was also convinced that identifying these structures gives us our best philosophical lead as to the very nature of being, because if you can see the structures which a Dasein, basically a human being, takes on, then you can ask a be-er, as it were, what it is to be. Therefore, the study of Dasein, as Heidegger conceives of it, is our best lead to ontology, not the study of what exists, but rather the study of what it is to be. Okay, that's a quick crash course in Heidegger. Dugin, the important thing is to say, says that there is not one Dasein, there is not one structural condition on the possibility of lived experience, but rather there are several. Each ethnos has its own. Now, decoloniality theory also invokes existential phenomenology, not to differentiate between ethnies directly, but rather to differentiate between colonizer and colonized. And that is where this idea of the coloniality of being comes in. So Nelson Maldonado-Torres from Puerto Rico has argued that there is a distinctive, phenomenologically verifiable lived experience of colonization. The lived experience of racialized people, those on the receiving end of the coloniality of power, which is deeply touched by the encounter with misanthropic skepticism, the constant encounter with violence and death. In an allusion to Frantz Fanon, he calls this subject, the subject of this distinct lived experience, the damné. It is the colonized is not ordinary Dasein. So this is the parallel. Just like Dugin, he says there is not one Dasein, one structure of Dasein being a subject, but rather there are several. Except here the break is not along the lines of ethnos, but rather along the line of being a colonizer or being colonized. And that's why for Nelson Maldonado-Torres, this damné consciousness or lived experience is not only of social significance, but of ontological significance as well. Being has a colonial aspect, and that is the coloniality of being. Well, the turn to metaphysics, and specifically the turn to existential phenomenology, means that the fate of these two theories is tied closely to an idiosyncratic and controversial current of thought in metaphysics. All I want to argue now is that even if we're on board with existential phenomenology, and even if, for the sake of argument, we're on board with at least one of the versions of epistemic ethnonationalism, which we've heard about so far, we can't get existential phenomenology to do the work for these two bodies of theory that they want it to. Why not? If the claim of these theorists is that extended exposure from birth to a distinctive cultural, and in the case of Dugin, climatic milieu, or to racism and colonial prejudice in the decoloniality theorists, affects any individual subject, or would affect any individual subject in the way that Dugin and then Maldonado-Torres describe, then surely the distinctive aspects of lived experience which these writers are homing in on are not conditions on the very possibility of lived experience or being in the world, quite generally, but rather they're contingent aspects of what existential phenomenologists call a subject's facticity, the contingent circumstances into which they are thrown. Consequently, if Dugin and Maldonado-Torres were to persuade us that subjects who grow up in such circumstances relate to themselves and people around them and the prospect of their own death, for example, what Heidegger calls being towards death, in quite different ways from those described by the classic existential phenomenologists like Heidegger and Sartre, then the conclusion we should actually draw is not that those subjects are ontologically different, that being is divided among ethnoses or among the damné and the colonizer, but rather that Heidegger and Sartre, in their classic existential works, failed to identify structural conditions on the very possibility of lived experience, and were instead recording contingent attitudes and experiences, perhaps typical of their own cultural and social milieu. So far from being able to base themselves on existential phenomenology, the central claims of neo-Traditionalism and Dugin's and decoloniality theory, if we take them seriously, actually threaten to pull the rug out from under the justification they're seeking in metaphysics. I'll just mention very briefly, decoloniality theory's use of existential phenomenology faces an additional challenge, which is that even if, contrary to what I've argued, Maldonado-Torres' concept of the damnée does succeed in driving a metaphysical wedge between colonizer and colonized, on both sides of that wedge, there are going to be different, what Quijano calls ethnies, different epistemes, which you want to sort people into, whether they're American or African or Asian, as colonizers, whether they are, Atlantic or South European. And so it can't do all the grounding work of identity policing, which decoloniality theory requires it to do. All right, that was very quick, but you can come back to any of that in Q&A. Let me just end by making one further point, which is a brief comparison of epistemic ethnonationalism with postmodernism or postcolonialism. Because people, when they encounter Dugin's theory or decoloniality theory, they often say this is just another form of lazy postmodernist relativism. And I think that that is unfair, because in fact it's something very much worse. Postmodernism and postcolonialism, yes, they give us forms of relativism, but it's usually a discourse relativism. The idea that the truth of a statement or a belief is relative to the epistemic system within which it occurs. But Dugin and Ndlovu-Gatsheni and Mignolo and Maldonado-Torres, they go further, and they say truth is not relative ultimately to epistemic systems or epistemes, but rather to the ethnos for which that episteme is proper. So this is a form of ethno-relativism as opposed to discourse relativism. And so that's where they would differentiate themselves from, for example, Foucault. Second point, epistemic ethno-nationalism in the forms that we've looked at it tries to have its cake and eat it. It doesn't abandon meta-narratives like Jean-François Lyotard in his famous postmodernist tract. Because what do Dugin and what do decoloniality theory tell us? They tell us that over at least the past 500 years, the West has economically exploited and violently subjugated much of the rest of the world, has exported, promoted, sometimes imposed a set of beliefs and values and rational standards, worse still, managed to convince some non-Westerners that not only their local beliefs and values, but even those of the West are potential candidates for objective and universal truth. Both theoretical approaches, it's hard to deny, present us with a grand narrative of world history of the last 500 years, which they present as true, as objectively true, as universally true. We're entitled to ask, if they're allowed to make such controversial claims and tell us that they're objectively and universally true, why are we readers not allowed to do so? Why are we only allowed to have truth relative to our ethnos? Why are we only allowed to assess our beliefs and thoughts on the basis of whether they are proper to the ethnos which they tell us that we belong to? That's the second point. The third point arises from those previous two, and it is that epistemic ethno-nationalism, in both its neo-traditionalist form and its decoloniality theory form, is a crutch to a certain form of politics, an exclusionary identitarian politics and a politics of identity policing. And let me finish by giving one example from recent South African politics of epistemic ethno-nationalism, of perhaps more the decoloniality theory version in action. So you may remember that Lindiwe Sisulu made an abortive bid for the presidency at the beginning of this year, and of the ANC in the first instance. She published an article in which she said, a part of the article said this: the most dangerous African today is the mentally colonized African. And when you put them in leadership positions or as interpreters of the law, they are worse than your oppressor. They have no African or Pan-African inspired ideological grounding, linking belief system to an ethnos. Some are confused by foreign belief systems. Right, so this is an example of how, I'm not saying that decoloniality theory has been a great influence on politics in South Africa or really anywhere so far. But I am saying that there is this core to decoloniality theory, but also, and this is much more widely acknowledged, the neo-traditionalism of people like Dugin, which supports this kind of political discourse. Whatever the motivations for this kind of political discourse might be, it gives a grounding in purportedly intellectual theories for this kind of exclusionary identity policing. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, George. So we'll take some questions. If there are any questions in the house, we'll go there. Okay, number one. Okay, go for it.
Thank you, Dr. Howard, you said right at the beginning that the epistemic now comes before the economic, and a lot of this is inspired by Marxism, which takes the economic structure as its basis. Why do you think there's been this reversal, where it used to be a case of economics came first, and then epistemic, but now epistemic comes first, and now economics second?
In the dependency theory tradition? Well, I think the reason for that is because the problems, the limits of predictive powers of the economistic theories were noted, and so it's quite right to bring in to acknowledge that ideas can have an explanatory force. So I think that's probably the main reason. That doesn't mean that you have to become a decoloniality theorist. Yeah.
So do you think it's that the Marxist economics has become discredited, but not so much the Marxist cultural influence on these types of theorists?
Well, look, I mean, I think a lot of people who call themselves Marxists would say that the stepwise sort of development that I described with dependency theory to decoloniality theory means that they stopped being Marxists. And I'm not really wedded to whether they are or not. All I'm noting is that decoloniality theory got to this place of epistemic ethnonationalism from a more economistic Marxism to begin with, whereas neo-traditionalism got to it from a totally different place, which was this perennialist integral traditionalism of Guénon. So that's really all I wanted to emphasize. Hi, Claire.
Thanks for your talk. It was very compelling. People who I've encountered who are sort of opponents of decoloniality would respond to that to say, well, those four people don't really represent decolonial theory, and might cite other people to say, there's a spirit of decoloniality and it's about fighting the power of the West and epistemic injustice and so forth. So, what would you say that you think that decoloniality can be salvaged if we just say, okay, well, these ones, they're the bad apples, or do you think that it cannot be salvaged?
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Well, look. So I think that there is such a thing as epistemic injustice. I think it's worth studying. I've tried to write about it myself. I think that the broader project of intellectual decolonization in the sense of identifying biases in fields of study and thinking about how to address that, thinking about where the blind spots have been because of where the resourcing has been and that kind of thing, is absolutely a worthy enterprise. It makes sense. Decoloniality theory is very, very specific. I mean, it might claim to be part of that, and we can dispute whether it really is, but it's a very specific body of theory. So what I'm restricting myself to today is saying that that particular body of theory, these people who theorize decoloniality in that way, that's certainly not the way to go. Now, as to whether intellectual decolonization in a broader sense is worthwhile, that I think is a different question. But if that's to be pursued, not this way.
We'll go ahead and then we'll come to this side. We'll there and then we'll come to you.
The way that we think about things, is there a place for something that decoloniality refers to as relocated enunciation? And I also want to ask refers to this as sort of functional essentialism, strategic essentialism.
Thank you. So the locus, you were asking about locus of enunciation, right? Yeah. So locus of enunciation is used in two ways in decoloniality theory. Firstly, to refer to whether you are speaking from a place of being a colonizer or a colonized, right? And that's the coloniality of being sense. Now, I've suggested that that is not an ontological distinction, that we can't actually, it doesn't have the grounding that it purports to have. The other way in which it's really used is when it's assigning people to ethnies, in the sense that Quijano uses that term, whether you are Andean and so should be using your Andean concept of time, or whether you're Spanish and you should be using your Spanish concept of time. Now, I also think that that's a problematic idea for the reasons that I've given. Nativism, well, nativism, it's sort of it's usually used as a critical term, right, as a pejorative term. And so many people would say that, well, let me put it in the context of my talk, in a sense, in order to avoid the accusation of nativism, decoloniality theorists and also neo-traditionalists, they go to metaphysics rather than physical differences to assign people into ethnoses, right? What I'm saying is that they don't manage to find the alternative grounding that they're looking for there. As for strategic essentialism, well, if that involves pretending that there are a kind of essence, there is a kind of essence, or there are these ontological or metaphysical bases for differences, when in fact there aren't, you know, I think that can't be used as a strategy because it's so unpredictable where that's going to lead to. So academics, they can't organize who's going to buy the milk. The idea that academics should be writing books strategically, using concepts in a false way, which is then going to lead to good consequences, I find totally, a non-starter. Sally Haslanger, in analytic philosophy, also proposes something along those lines. Personally, I don't think that that's the way to do conceptual analysis.
Thanks so very much for this talk. I've got 2 points. One is just a query as to your reply to this talk of epistemic ethnonationalism, and the second is about the philosophical grounding of decoloniality. So regarding the first, I understand from your brief, reply to a previous question that the answer that you would provide to ethno-nationalism is to say, in the terms that there are discriminations in knowledge systems, that you still have to have a framework from which you can provide a judgment as to what is missing in the Western form of knowledge. So that presumes that it's still valid criteria by which both sides in the debate might agree that there is a form of discrimination in the knowledge system of the Western world. Well, if you take that epistemic ethnonationalism, you no longer have a ground upon which to debate because you either are epistemic number 1 or epistemic number 2, and there's no ground on which we can even start discussing.
Yes.
Because we don't have a framework. That's why,
yes.
Rejecting the Kantian framework is kind of a red a light in that respect. So confirm to me if that is my correct understanding. The second point is about the philosophical grounding. I was a brief, advert to the fact that existential phenomenology cannot provide the kind of ontological or epistemological grounding, especially ontological, to decoloniality theory.
Yes.
Is that because, in Heidegger's view, the structural design are universal structures, and therefore they cannot be seen as purely relative to a particular ethne, or is it because decoloniality actually misinterprets Heidegger? So I just want to know the philosophical ground. Why is it that existential phenomenology cannot provide an ontological grounding to decoloniality?
Yes, okay, thank you. So on the first question, yes, I think that both theories that as regards the common framework, they're trying to have one and not have one at the same time, right? I think you understand the point I'm making, because they're trying to make these normative claims about the discrimination which has occurred. They're also trying to give us a whole lot of statements which they want us to accept as true, right? Which apply across the board to all of these areas, and not relative to a particular ethnos, and that's inconsistent with their overall project. So that's what I would say about that. They're both trying to do it, but you can't have your relativism and eat your universalism. On the second point, is it because the ontology of a Dasein has to be universal? Well, in a sense it is, but not just as a dogmatic matter. And I don't want to argue dogmatically from what Heidegger says, right? Because of course, what Dugin and what the decoloniality theorists are trying to do is say, Heidegger thought that Dasein was universal, but in fact there are several Daseins. Now, my point is this: the problem with that is that how is that still a philosophical project? Because Heidegger and Sartre, they talk about being towards death, how a Dasein relates to its own death. They talk about authenticity versus inauthenticity, being with, das Man and all of that. These are supposed to be categories which are discernible through phenomenological investigation, not through sociology, not through psychology, right? Not through history. Now, if you start saying, gosh, if you've been colonized, or gosh, if you've grown up on the Great Steppe of Russia, then everything's different. You think about death in a totally different way. That's the kind of thing that Dugin says. Or you think about the absurd or authenticity in a totally different way. Now, if that's true, then it means that tracing these structures of thought about death or authenticity or the absurd is not a philosophical project. It's not a philosophical project. Because it's not a priori. It's not prior to experience. It's not prior to your upbringing, your culture, your history. And so that's why I say they're pulling the rug out from under themselves. Because the moment they say, oh, we're going to metaphysics to ground this difference in ethnos or ethne, or the colonized and the colonizer, and then they say, oh gosh, there are several different Daseins, they're no longer grounding it in philosophy of any kind. Yeah. What do you mean by a leveling?
A leveling, it's the same thing.
Oh, so they're blurring them all together.
Exactly, yeah. Blurring them together between knowledge, value, gnoseology, etc. Because if somebody like Dugin speaks about a special Russian truth and uses the word gnoseology or gnoseological pluralism, for me that doesn't really not a problem, because he speaks about questions which are spiritual and mythical. He doesn't speak about knowledge.
Yeah, I think that the generations are perceptible, and it's really about how far the theorists have moved from the more economistic dependency theory. The article which Quijano co-authored with Wallerstein is still very much in this sort of dependency theory, world systems theory. The primary thing which is going on is that capitalism requires different forms of labor. It's put compulsory labor over here, it's put wage labor over here, and it needs some sort of governing ideology. And it's when that gets, as soon as that gets flipped, and you say, well, actually, the primary explanatory factor is what people think, rather than the economic structure that you've got to the second generation. So of course that's a process, but I think that gives us, two sort of poles. Now, as to whether there's a blurring in the language in decoloniality theory, yes, there's a lot of loose use of language, and that's something one has to battle with. But because they basically got this one big point which they want to apply to both values and beliefs and concepts and methods. And so I think that's the reason why words get used quite loosely, because they're not very interested in distinguishing between values and beliefs. They're interested in saying, well, whatever values are, whatever beliefs are, the same thing applies to them, that you need to have the ones which correspond with your ethnos or ethnie.
Would it still be okay for the project to go on if it claimed that maybe it's not philosophical problem, but it is concerned with philosophical ontology? Maybe
yes.
It's not so much concerned with ontology, maybe it's concerned with political ontology of essentialism, which is not living. Or maybe it's not even concerned with epistemology proper, but maybe no concern with onto epistemology. Is it a worthy project?
Well, it depends what you mean by the decolonial project. Because if it's, as Claire was the one that I'm critiquing. Oh, okay. Look, it is a problem for, this is the problem. Because the decoloniality theorists, they dance around this quite a lot, precisely because they're worried about the accusation of nativism, right, which we talked about just now. But then when you do pin them down, they're saying that there are different ethnies, or depending on whether, I don't want to fixate on that word too much, by the way. The idea is that depending whether you're African, Andean, Spanish, German, or whatever, that tells you what beliefs or values you ought to be having. Now, if you're going to carry on with that commitment, which I think is the bad one, I would say throw out that commitment. That's the non-starter. If by the decolonial project you mean holding on to that commitment and then finding a grounding for it, well, I would say good luck to the decoloniality theorists, because the reason that they're going to this abstruse metaphysics is because they, of course, don't want to be nativists in the old-fashioned, race science sense, right? That's why they're going to Heidegger, and that's the same with Dugin. Can I think of an alternative grounding? Well, not a very plausible one, and I would say, don't go down that, get off that bus several stops before then.
Wasn't there a hand here? And then we go back there, and there was another one here.
Thanks. So, two related questions from someone who's not read any of this material. The first one, was it clear to me what fixes my membership of an ethnos according to these people if it isn't ethnicity or race? So that was one question. The other one is there a pragmatic refutation of these kind of views, considering that all these people you mentioned are communicating intelligently with one another? I mean, they're from Peru, they're from Russia, they're from India, they're from God knows where. So is that perhaps a standing refutation?
Yes. So what fixes membership of an ethnos? They're using terms which have been associated with race and ethnicity, as I said, and then they're dancing around what exactly the basis for ethnos membership is. They go to metaphysics because they think, maybe it's based in the difference of Dasein, but as I said in my talk, I think that's a non-starter. So that's the answer to the first one. Yes, I suppose. It really depends whether you can have a theory like this without being committed to total non-translatability. And I think that there's no reason. I think there's sometimes, especially somebody like Mignolo, he does seem to be saying, oh, you know, gosh, the concept for time in the Andes is totally incommensurable and incomprehensible for somebody from Europe. And then he explains what it is. So there's a kind of contradiction there. I agree. But I mean, I don't want to press too hard on that, because I think you could have a view like this and not be committed to total non-intertranslatability.
There are so many provocations. Excuse me, I don't even know where to start. Because firstly, you are overstating the ethno, and your work. I'm wondering, why is it that you are fixated with this? I mean, for someone who's saying is committed to epistemic justice,
okay,
the way in which you rail across decoloniality and relating it, of course, contact against it and across, and relating it to some right-wing,
yes. Yes.
I don't know where I'm worried. You may not be telling the truth. Anyway, the overstating of the ethno itself, I would say, is not justified, simply because decoloniality is not in itself fixated with people's ethnic identities, but it's fixated with questions of liberation and oppression. And what you call contingencies are actually, contingency is actually understating or under-explaining what they're talking about. They're referring to a paradigm. 500 years is not, a simple contingent thing that comes. It's a paradigm. And by a paradigm, I'm referring not just to historical events, but to the kind of discursive, current modes of thought, traditions of thought, intellectual systems that go with them. And the commitment to liberation itself then allows them to actually deconstruct concepts of modernity, concepts of being, and the entire philosophical canon of Western, what has been called the Western philosophical canon. So, in a way, I'm having a problem with the fact that you're not speaking to what they are deconstructing. You're speaking more, to issues that you relate to their fixation with some ethnic identities and stuff. And that's not what they're doing. The way I understand what they're doing is that they are committed to a liberated, kind of a discursive paradigm, and they do not actually impose a theory of how to go about that, because liberation, on its own, must be not rather necessarily dependent on ideas that are preset, but it must be fulfilling, it must be real, it must be empowering. I'll stop there because
no, thank you. Look, I think you're right. They're not, decoloniality theorists, the ones I quote, they don't talk, and that's why I said, actually, I don't want to fixate on the word ethnos or ethne. I mean, I gave you a quote where Quijano is using it quite clearly, right? But I don't want to fixate on that. Now, the question, so you say it's not really so much about ethne, it's about liberation. And I think that is a central tension within decoloniality theory, because on the one hand, I think what you said is absolutely right in the sense that they want to say the difference is about politics, it's about power, it's about the divide between colonized and colonizer, and they want to find an ontological basis for that in what Maldonado-Torres says about the damné and all the sorts of paradigms which go along with that, which you just mentioned. But when they talk about particular cases, they talk about the imposition of Spanish time, of Western thought on people who, previously, or they should have the African episteme or Andean time and those sorts of things. Now, for the reader, we're owed an explanation. What makes something Andean time? What makes something an African episteme? And the divide between colonizer and colonized doesn't do that. Right? So that's one of the points I was making in critique of the concept of the coloniality of being. So it is fine to say there's a divide in terms of power globally, which is a legacy of colonization. That's fine. I have no objection to that. And the idea that produces claims of justice, including epistemic justice, again, I have no problem with that. But on both sides of that divide, there are a number of different categories which they use these geographical words for. And we are owed an explanation of what they mean by that. Especially now, you say, isn't their aim to deconstruct the Western canon and Western ideas? Well, that can mean various different things. If the goal is to show where the problems, where the false claims, where the inconsistencies and the parts of the theories that we should jettison are, I'm also on board with that project. But what is distinctive about decoloniality theory is it says the question is not, is this true? Because truth without parenthesis, that's what we've got to throw out. It says rather, does each knowledge with a geographical tag next to it, Spanish time, African epistemes, etc., do they have equal power? That's how they conceive of liberation. That's how Ndlovu-Gatsheni conceives of liberation, is how Mignolo conceives of liberation. And if you conceive of liberation in that way, equalizing the different knowledges associated with the different ethnies, then you'd better give us an account of how you can tell which ethne you belong to and which knowledge correlates with which ethne. So, so I agree with a lot of your characterization, but I'm saying, despite that being true of the shape of that theory, these questions come up.
Okay, we're looking at time. We can only take one more question, but then we have drinks upstairs, so you can quickly engage George. Thank you. So we'll come to you and maybe we'll squeeze one.
I wanted to follow up on the identity policing.
Yes.
Systems and judgments like someone is an epistemic comprador. So, is to give an account of what makes you a member of an ethnos, are you at the same time giving an account of what compels you to adopt or espouse certain ideas? So is the normative force itself of going to be something that's metaphysical, or does it rely on the linguistic schools of the world actually policing people? So power in the real world as opposed to something metaphysical.
So I don't understand the last step in your question. What's she doing which is normative?
What's the basis? So she's saying that someone who is African has to behave a particular way.
Yes.
Otherwise they're a traitor. If they espouse a colonial mentality,
yes.
They would be a comprador. So what is the normative force? If she was able to successfully say what makes someone an African, would that also at the same time amount to giving an account of the normative force of that membership?
Well, it depends what she said, right? Because I think what you're saying is that it might be possible to give an answer to the question who is African, who is European, who is Spanish, etc., without that answer containing anything about what you should believe. Right, so absolutely, I agree with you. So that kind of account of what it is to be African or what it is to be European wouldn't be enough for decoloniality theory, and it wouldn't be enough also for the claims like that which are made in politics. So that's why you need something quite special. That's why I said there are these desiderata for the bearer of culture, according to decoloniality theory. It has to stay constant across what people actually believe, what values they actually espouse, and it has to ground, as you put it, these normative claims. How would it do so? Well, I wouldn't want to speculate. I've gone through a couple of accounts of how it would do so, and I've said these don't cut the mustard. So you're I think we're agreeing.
Yes, that's precisely what I'm curious about. Like, is the hope for some sort of metaphysical justice?
Yeah, right, I see.
That has normative force. Is that a non-starter, such that the actual normative force
yes.
relies on, in the real world, people who will power, actually able to coerce you, or whether...
Well, that doesn't sound like normative force. That sounds like bullying. I think the reason that both these bodies of theory they make this turn to metaphysics is because with existential phenomenology you get these ideas like for example, authenticity, inauthenticity, things like that, and that's a normative idea. And so, if or bad faith in Sartre, for example. And so that's why it seems like a promising idea, because number one, it's not physical, it's not race, it's metaphysical. Number two, there seem to be these normative ideas at the root of existential phenomenology. So I think what Dugin was hoping for and what Maldonado-Torres was hoping for was that you would find this structure through the existential phenomenological method, which would ground the kind of statements of what you ought to believe, what your values ought to be, if you are of a particular ethne or a different ethne. And I'm just suggesting that's not going to happen, because as soon as you split apart Dasein, or the underlying subject of this kind of existential engagement, it's no longer a philosophical basis after all.
Right, we'll squeeze one last one, and then we'll engage George upstairs.
It's a quick one. As somebody who's like from outside this field, it seems to me that race seems to be the easiest marker for the categorization that you described.
Yes.
But I'm also aware that it is a fraught concept.
Yes.
And there'll be sensitivities and so forth around going down that path.
Yes.
My question is, you say that race has been discredited. I think that's a point that you made.
Yes.
I'd like to find out what is meant by that, and what's the evidence for that. When you say discredited, has no significance, material significance?
Yeah.
And if so, what is the strength of that evidence, bearing in mind that I'm aware that there will be sensitivities in terms of actually trying to look at it perhaps too closely?
Yeah, oh, sure. Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, that's a totally fair question. So the sense in which I meant race is discredited is that back in the day, in the heyday of race science, in the 19th century, early 20th century, people were coming up with these theories of, if one is of race 1, then not only do you look a certain way, but you are more likely to have these sorts of values, you're more likely to have these sorts of beliefs, et cetera, et cetera. So they were thinking that they would find in a biological concept of race the basis for these kinds of normative judgments about what people ought to be believing, or what was the most fitting or appropriate belief or value or kind of undertaking for different races. Now, that biological sense of race is what has been discredited, because not only do all studies show that all humans can become part of any culture if they're brought up in it, and that all humans, that there are no difference by quote unquote race in the kind of capabilities which are associated with learning or believing or having values and things like that. Now, people do, of course, continue to talk about races, but they usually want to talk about race as a social construct, right? As something which is a matter of how one is categorized, what society expects of you. Now, I would prefer to call that racialized group, how you're racialized, but I'm okay with that concept. Now, my point is that that second concept of race, the minimal, very thin, socially constructed concept of race, that could never give us the account of the bearer of culture, which decoloniality theory or Aleksandr Dugin are after. Because it's mainly passive, for one thing. It's about how society categorizes one, how one is perceived by others. It says nothing about one's intrinsic capabilities or one's intrinsic likelihood to take on certain values or beliefs.
One more hand for George. And let's meet upstairs for a glass of something. I will...